So there I was, only half awake, drinking Yorkshire tea. And I happened upon this quote on Pinterest. And the quote said, "Why is it only art if you like it?" And that effectively woke me up. Hi everyone, Maya here. Thank you for tuning in. I'm really excited about today's video. I think it should be interesting. It's going to be an analysis, it's going to be a critique, and it's going to be an exploration of the future of poetry. Recently, and by recently I mean like in the last 5-7 years, there has been a sweeping phenomenon, particularly on Instagram, of short little blurbs of poetry. I'm talking about Rupi Kaur, I'm talking about Amanda Lovelace and Atticus and Cleo Wade, those poets out there that post their poems instead of officially, traditionally publishing them. This has become a really controversial topic in the world of literature, and that is because people are afraid of how it's redefining poetry. Whether or not it's really poetry is a huge debate that goes on, and whether or not poetry has morphed from an artistic expression into a capitalist-driven, consumerist product. Picture the scene. I am in the 8th grade, okay, at this time, and I'm at the Barnes & Noble, which I miss dearly now. I took it for granted, and I wander into the poetry section because it used to be right next to the YA fiction section, and I saw this book called Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. And I just thought it looked so pretty. It was very minimalistic in its design. I loved that the cover was printed in black and then the ink was white on top of it, like the letters were white. I was blown away. So I pick it up. I'm leafing through it, looking at all the poems and the little illustrations, very, very simplistic, very line-driven drawings, very nice, very aesthetically pleasing. And I'm a little bit confused because this is highly, highly different from the poetry I'm exposed to at school. In the 8th grade, in my writing class, we had a whole unit on poetry. When that was announced, practically everyone in the classroom groaned. That is because the way poetry is taught in middle schools and high schools, as far as I'm aware, is very boring. It's a lot of annotating. It's a lot of trying to dissect exactly what the author was trying to convey, when a lot of the time, I'm assuming the author didn't know what they were trying to convey themselves. Poetry is an exploration of the human experience, not a definition. Traditional, older poetry is vitally important to our history, not only as a culture, but as an artistic species. And now in 2020, people are quite worried and quite conflicted over the topic of Instapoetry. Instapoetry, first and foremost, defies all of the conventional structures and processes of poetry. Now we are getting poems that are very short, they're bite-sized. I've seen them described as pithy. And in my opinion, pithy statements like these that seem more like the theme you would extract from a larger poem than a poem in itself. Pithy statements like these are appealing because they satisfy our desire for instant gratification, and they play deeply into the consumerist culture of many countries around the world. We live in a very consumer-driven economy. I don't think I really need to give you examples, but I will anyway. Starting in the 1950s, fast food, yippee, cars, highways, the big suburban house, the new TV, the new car, the best new iPhone, all that jazz. And because we live in such a consumerist society, we like things that are accessible. Not only monetarily, but also just in terms of being widely appealing and available to people of different backgrounds and in different positions in life. Instapoetry satisfies both of these criteria. First of all, you don't have to pay for it. It's just a post on social media. You can like it, you can screenshot it, it's there for you forever. It also satisfies our need to create an opinion about something and develop a meaning from something in a short space of time. This is why I think SparkNotes is so amazing and appealing for high schoolers. Instead of spending hours and hours reading a novel we're actually not interested in for school, we can just log on, to Spark Notes or Schmoop, something like that, and get the general summary and gist of what a book is talking about. We want to know the core message, we want to know the core plot, and we are less concerned with flowery language and extraordinary detail. All right, in my research for this video, I came across a quote from poet Rachel Allen that I thought I would share because I found it really interesting. And that quote is as follows: "Poetic form has always been affected by the medium in which it's presented." Here's why I love that so much. Poetry isn't really easy to put in a box because, of course, it can be in written form, but then you have spoken poetry, you have spoken word, you have performance poetry. Poetry can be found in nature. Because of that, poetry has really evolved over time. In the days of the cavemen, we drew and painted on walls of caves before we even knew how to construct walls. We used what was available to us to express our opinions, our feelings, our beliefs, and our values in life in an artistic manner. Then my mind goes to Shakespearean England, where poetry was embedded in plays, in theater. Then, of course, you have the Harlem Renaissance, which dealt with a lot of social justice issues and created a lot of change in society. And now we've arrived at the age of the Instapoet. The Instapoet of 2020 is pretty much concerned with cliches. You want love? Be love. You need light? Be light. It doesn't require a ton of critical thinking. It sort of spoon feeds the reader or the viewer, depending on the method the poetry is portrayed. It spoon feeds them the message. There is no subtext. There's very little nuance in these poems. Vinu Kaspar has said that it can be meaningless. It has a lack of emotion. There's a lack of soul and spirit that is poured into these words that can be found in more traditional poetry. He has said that Instapoetry has turned poetry into a capitalist endeavor, which we touched on previously. And I agree. I agree that Instagram is the epitome of the capitalist society in which we live. It pretty much exists to get people addicted to it so that they can view ads, so that they can be influenced, and so that they can buy products that will satisfy a gaping hole in their lives, as dark and miserable and jaded as that sounds. But at the same time, I think Instapoetry has a lot of potential. First of all, it's accessible. We've talked about this. You don't have to pay to view Instapoetry. It's pretty much accessible to anyone who has an electronic device. That means that poetry is being exposed to a younger audience, which I think is really important, even if it's not the conventional poetry that people love to annotate and love to dive into and savor. That means that the poetry is then more available to marginalized groups. So more young women are being exposed to poetry. More people belonging to the LGBTQ+ community are exposed to a form of poetry. More people of color, more people with disabilities, etc. It's just widening the range of people who have an ability to connect with and to see poetry. And in turn, I feel like that has the potential to create some fantastic new voices in the poetry scene. The next reason I think Instapoetry is actually not a bad thing is that although it deals with pretty much solely cliches, there's a reason that cliches are cliche. It was some sort of interview with Timothée Chalamet, and he was talking about Greta Gerwig and his experience working with her in the movies Lady Bird and Little Women. And he said that once when they were on set, she told the cast that cliches are the most important things in life. And it resonated with him because it is true. Cliches are so prevalent in our world and in the entertainment industry, whether that's film, television, novels, poetry, anthologies, music, because so many people can resonate with them. Because cliches are kind of the general embodiment of the human experience. No matter where you come from, no matter your background, no matter what you hope to be in the world, there is something in your life that can connect you to other people. And I feel like cliches are those things. Because of that, I think Instapoetry can have a huge influence over people. Although we know these cliches, they're a good reminder, specifically because we're living in a world of extreme consumerism. It's nice to reflect on just the core things that make a human, that make a life rich and meaningful. The last reason that Instapoetry has potential is that I think that overall it's safe to say that it's increasing poetry sales. Here's my thought process. If people are buying these anthologies and collections because they've been exposed to these poets over social media, the poetry collections they're looking for are often grouped in a similar aisle or a similar area on the internet with more classical traditional forms of poetry. If people decide that they love Amanda Lovelace's poems about October and falling leaves and coffee at midnight, then, when they go to pick up the Amanda Lovelace book, they'll see some Pablo Neruda or some Mary Oliver or some Maya Angelou, some more classic, well-loved poets on that shelf. And because of that, I feel that Instapoetry has the potential to lead to increased sales in traditional poetry. Why is it only art if you like it? I don't love all art. I'm not a fan of Rupi Kaur personally, although middle school Maya was obsessed. But that doesn't mean that her artwork is not art. There is some amount of her that she has poured into those poems. There's personal experience, and there are layers, and there is depth in a person. And when that person creates art, whether or not it appears deep and insightful to you, to them, it holds some level of significance. I like to think that Instapoets are creating their artwork and posting it online for people to see, not solely because they want to make money. You are not, if you want to be a millionaire, becoming a booktuber is not the best way to go about it. And I'm willing to bet that the majority of people would say becoming an Instapoet is not going to be an assured gateway to success. And I feel like whether or not you are a poet in the traditional sense, you write long form, you write haikus, you write more classic poetry, or you are an Instapoet, they're both important. Art is art, and I think that when we start criticizing art for not being art, we're forgetting what art means. Art at its core is just the expression of the human experience, and who are you, who am I, who are any of us to say that someone's expression of their life is inaccurate? Who are we to judge art? For that reason, although I completely understand the controversy of Instapoetry, I think it is a very valid art form. I think we should support it, and I think it has the ability to bring poetry, a so well-loved art form that has existed for generations of people, for centuries, to a new group of people. That's all for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. It is National Poetry Month. I forgot to say that. That's the whole reason I made this video. It's National Poetry Month. So if you feel so inclined, go pick up some poems. Go read some haikus or write some limericks. And if you write a limerick, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And I will see you all on Sunday. Have a fantastic weekend.